So now I want to discuss a second case example, another couple. So this was a couple in which there was a whole lot of gaslighting and questioning of reality, and the kind of theme of this was no one else is scared of me, was what the narcissistic spouse would say. So there were some very subtle things that played out in this treatment that were kind of blatantly obvious to me. So, one of the main characteristics of the narcissistic partner was always being the victim. And even when talking about the other partner and validating them, they would turn it around to how they have feelings too that they want to express about them, right? That it was about their character looking good, that no one else is scared of me if there was a criticism. I'm really sorry you felt that way, but no one else is scared of me, or I'm really sorry you felt that way. But you put me in this position to feel this way, or you were victimized so many times it would make sense that you would feel this way about me because this is just part of your past victimization. So thematically, this stuff would play out. Some of the very subtle narcissistic abuse, which was very disturbing, is if so. One of the children at one point was very sick, and and this person had a very weak immune system, so they were going to attend a session together. The narcissistic partner was going to stay with the child because that was just the agreement they had for some reason. And when the parent was going to stay with the child, the narcissistic one, they were discussing feeling sick and thinking they had the flu, right? So that put this other parent who was coming into the session individually that day in a state of panic because this very susceptible immune system now had someone who possibly had the flu. And that was a way of really getting into the other partner's head and messing with the security, the foundational security of things, and making themselves powerful but cruel and retaliatory because they were put in this position of responsibility. They feared being character attacked in this individual session, so they fostered a situation to induce panic and discomfort and to focus on that and to be in one's head in a negative way, but happy that they were only thinking of them. That same narcissist actually in my office would do some very subtle things. And so if that person felt confronted, they would leave my office kind of morose and mopey and withhold payment for a period. They wouldn't pay right away. They would say they forgot their credit card. And usually in my sessions, my patients pay me at the session, usually at the end of the session. In this scenario, this person would say they forgot their card, they would get sent an invoice, they would withhold payment until they got a reminder. Another thing they would do is block my clock when they would come in and consciously kind of bump it very subtly so that I would lose my sense of time and access to time, and they would attempt to either gain more time or put me in a position where I'd have to look at my watch and then act as if I was kind of being detrimental and making the situation feel rushed. So it's very, very subtle but very repetitive. The other example was of a narcissistic parent that was a narcissistic mother, and there were some very key moments that were very significant, and one of them was repetitive, very similar to the Susan Stills. And I actually saw a sibling of this same patient many years after I saw this patient who had the same mother, and they both had a similar experience. They identified themselves as the little SHITSs. For the sake of censorship, I'll just spell the word, I guess. And their core sense of themselves was that they are that. They are the S word. And that was because they had been called little S words their whole childhood, their whole life, that they really questioned their value and believed it was to S. And so they would had an immense drive to prove this parent wrong, this mother wrong, but that in that they didn't trust anyone that would connect with them. And so they had this kind of mantra, which is an old Groucho Marx joke, that I wouldn't belong to any club that would have me as a member. So that's like the core of self-deprecation, right? That there must be something up if they want anything to do with me. And so these two children were very, very successful. They had immense drive for success, but the loss for them was the ability to truly connect romantically and intimately with anyone, and to develop really lasting friendships, because their assumption was always rooted in suspicion of, why is this person valuing me? Because A, of their experience of exploitation by this other parent, and their devaluing of themselves was so immense that they questioned why anyone would interact with them. And they'd be aggressive in very passive aggressive or reciprocal narcissistic ways of people, because they assumed that that person was not coming from a wholesome framework of just wanting to connect, or just being attracted to them, or thinking well of them in any way. Some other examples that I remember really powerfully with one of those patients was two. At one point, this patient and their partner had to put their dog down because their dog was very, very sick. And so they called their parents to tell them, this happened today and we just want to let you know. And the first thing that came out of the narcissistic parent's mouth was, but I really loved that dog. Why would you do that? As if they had the power to kill this dog and make it sick, and they did that at the expense of this person. That's a very narcissistically selfish statement, right? But the root of it is it's so emotionally abusive in a way, because it also devalues and undermines their right to make a decision about whether they put their dog down or not, and that it was the right decision. So not only were they left with this guilt of did I do the right decision? Am I a murderer? Did I kill my dog? But also this strange way in which they wronged this parent. And sorry for the metal shaking background. I'm at my home office, and that was my dog on the sofa near me. Another experience this patient, one of these siblings had, was they had cut off from this parent for a period of time, and the parent would randomly send these emails. And one of those emails was a picture of herself as a kid. And it basically said, I thought you might like to see this. This is me with whatever great aunt as a kid. Someone found this and sent it to me. And so their sense that that person who was cut off would wish to see a picture of them as a child would be reparative was kind of comical in a sense. Like, of course, I'm cut off from you. I want to see a picture of you as a kid. Is it an attempt to humanize you? Is it an attempt to discount my existence and just be, oh, you were a kid once, I ought to, reconnect? It was really overwhelmingly and overpoweringly insulting, and maintained the separation for quite a bit longer. And the other really kind of disturbing, and I think Freud would have had a field day with this one, is that same patient and their spouse were going to have a baby. And one of the things you can do is you can save the placenta and the cord blood for different reasons in terms of holding on to the genetics and DNA, and have it, I believe, cryogenically frozen. And so this parent came up once and was asking them if they planned on saving that. And so they had decided they weren't going to do that. And this parent then was criticizing that couple for not doing that for her if she ever got sick, that she should have access to that stuff, and that it was directly against her that they made that decision, as opposed to they would have made the decision for that material to be available for their kids, not necessarily their parent whose DNA wouldn't fully match and it actually wouldn't be useful for. So the really, really subtle stuff can come out of what are we perceiving and seeing as narcissistic abuse clinically. So I want to get a little theory heavy just for a few minutes. And then the last two parts, the how does recovery look and the deeper work, I'll spend a little less time on that. So there are a couple of core theories that play into narcissistic abuse, and I think they're really important, and they're often ignored or not really fully explained in a graspable way. So I'm going to do my best. They're pretty heavy theories, so some of them can really be a full hour on their own. So I'll try to do them justice. So the first the first, this is like clinical examples, but very theoretically grounded. The first one is projective identification. Now, projective identification is best described by the psychoanalyst and psychiatrist Otto Kernberg. And he's still around today. He does a lot of work with borderline patients. And so oftentimes you'll see a level of deep narcissistic abuse in a borderline patient. I don't want to be too diagnostic heavy. I just kind of want to explain narcissism. But he did the core of his work with narcissistic borderline behaviors. But really focusing on borderline personality disorder is the core of his work. And Kernberg talked about how in projective identification, it's basically when someone has something uncontainable in themselves. And that uncontainable aspect of themselves can't be held, and so they kind of project it outwards. Now, I will give an example of how that exposes clinically someone's core pathology. So projective identification is usually experienced as an unexplainable pit in one's stomach. It often happens in people who are deeply empathic or highly desensitized to being susceptible to experiences that are really overwhelming, or who have been traumatized in the past. And a lot of therapists are incredibly susceptible to it, and it's kind of a good time to evaluate where it comes from if it doesn't feel like it makes sense. So I'm going to give you an email example because it's a pretty safe example to explain how this plays out. So I'm on a bunch of listservs, and in some of those listservs, people talk about referrals. And one time there was a therapist looking for a therapist for their patient who was trying to set boundaries on their narcissistic parents. So I said, oh, that's kind of right on my alley, and I responded. In that email, it said, who takes a specific insurance, just who takes it, not in network, not out of network. In my practice, I am out of network solely, but I do bill insurances, and I use a billing company so my patients get reimbursed directly by their insurance provider. So I responded and didn't think anything of it. I respond often, and you don't either hear anything or people say, I passed your name along. That's kind of the common courtesy thing. You know, nothing is not so courteous, but usually you get a, send your name along, that's that. Or, do you want to have a quick conversation about this? I'm going to pass your info along. So about a week later, I get this email that basically says, it's a misnomer and dishonest to say you take the insurance when you're not in network. And quite frankly, it's unethical. So I get this and I'm like, whoa, what? And on Sundays before going to work Monday, I'm very susceptible to like being thrown off. And I had this really overwhelming pit in my stomach. And I'm like, oh God, what is this about? Like, why am I being attacked? My ethics being attacked. So I respond an apology email. And then I reread that person's email, and I from the culture of listservs and the culture of this listserv, you were very clear about in-network or out-of-network, and so I felt kind of baited. And so I wrote, to attack my character is not really helpful, and I felt that was pretty unprofessional. You didn't clarify whether it was in-network or out-of-network. You just said take that insurance, and I thought, due to my expertise, I could be helpful. So if you want to pass my number along, fine. If you don't, that's fine, but you don't need to attack my character. I revoke my previous apology. And boy, did I open the floodgates. And so I got these kind of non sequitur fragmented emails that were about a page and a half long if you printed them up, lecturing me on the difference between in-network and out-of-network, and how green I must be, and how I just don't get things, and very belittling. Weirdly, I felt in that a deep sense of inadequacy. And I was like, why do I feel inadequate? This makes no sense, because this was actually a referral that I feel incredibly adequate and aware of and knowledgeable about. And so I did a little bit of sleuthing, okay? And so I looked at this person's website. And this person had a lot of work that was research on the experience of being abandoned, the experience of adoption, and the sense of abandonment that comes with that. And they labeled their expertise as working with college-age population. And so their whole life's work of research, of decades of research, and their expertise didn't align. And in the About Me part, there was one sentence that said, I know how overwhelming an experience it is to be adopted and to not know why you weren't wanted. And to me, the core pathology there is that person's projective identification that I took in was a deep sense of inadequacy that was uncontainable. And so to me, that's kind of the core of of what projective identification is. And for me, the easiest way to explain it. And I've had clinical examples where I feel either guilt or I feel incompetent. And it's really an aspect of this other patient's sense of what's uncontainable to them. And it takes me a while to get there because the pit in the stomach is paralyzing when you have this experience. Kernberg broke it down to 4 parts, and I'm just going to really simplistically say it because it's a very hardy kind of theory. But basically, you have the projection. It's kind of what's stated or what's communicated is put out there. Then you have the empathy the projector, the narcissist, feels for the statement because it's their own. So they like kind of get a sense of what they put out there upon you. They understand it. And then there's a level of what's called, on the third part, induction. And that is to put it upon the other. So I have empathy only when this is shot out and projected, and now it's in the other, it's inducted into the other. And the fourth part of that is it becomes an aspect of control. And so it's like a paralyzing way in which the narcissist unconsciously, in most cases, kind of puts stuff out there. And it's rooted in one of the only times they can really have deep empathy, when it's their own stuff they're putting on someone else. And so they can kind of feel it for them. And it's not like empathy, like I feel your pain, I'm sorry I put that upon you. It's like a deep sense of knowing what the other is experiencing, but being fulfilled that they're experiencing it now and the narcissist isn't. So that's loaded theory. If you want to learn more about it, I would look up, there's some great YouTube videos that Otto Kernberg does lectures on projective identification. So lack of empathy is core in narcissistic abuse, and it's really that the narcissist has this sense of the other as an object for them, not an independent object with their own feelings and thoughts, but they think of people as objects, and not in a tactical or manipulative way. It's an attachment style. It's about how they attach to people as objects that are complacent to them or not complacent to them, that work for them or don't, that function as an aspect of their ego or don't. And you could see that a lot in experience with a borderline relationship. But in a narcissistically abusive relationship, you're really getting this lack of empathy, not from a psychopath or sociopathic framework necessarily, but that this person works for me, and when they don't, I'm angry at them. So part of my sip of water there. I want to talk about narcissistic rage, which was a term developed by Kohut in 1972. And like Freud, I described at the beginning, that the Wolfman in the 1914 case had a narcissistic blow that kind of shook his foundation and was the core of his pathology, because he had this illness, but it didn't fit with his sense of perfect self that really shook him to the core. And in a sense, that's a narcissistic injury. So a narcissistic rage comes from a narcissistic injury. So a narcissistic injury may be, I didn't get an A on that paper and I really deserved one. And then the narcissistic rage may be criticizing that person, thinking of them as an idiot, or discrediting or devaluing them or undermining them. Or it can go all the way to a continuum of violence, right? We see some really disturbing violence, especially with some really modern day gun violence, where it's tied to rejection, or it's tied to being fired, or it's tied to being criticized in their workplace or being devalued in some way, that the narcissistic rage can be murderous, and it's not a joke. And that narcissistic abuse does fall on a continuum, right? And we'll talk about this in the sense of recovery. Are we talking about a narcissistic abuse that's someone's functioning from their early experiences that causes this need to be educated and to develop empathic understanding because they really want to connect? Or is this tied to someone's narcissistic rage that is dangerously murderous? And these are things that are really very clear in the clinical setting in most scenarios. But there are murder-suicides that throw people off guard and they just don't know what's coming. And so that's why threats need to be taken so seriously in the context of a narcissistic presentation, because it's a thing in which when there's a real narcissistic rage, they play with the concept of suicide, that this person's going to drive me to it, or they can become homicidal. And those are real extreme examples on the continuum, but when we're talking about a narcissistic rage, it's really something to be attentive to the aspects of for obvious reasons. So Kohut basically talks about that a narcissistic injury can happen when the ego is bruised. And like I talked about, getting an A or not getting an A, or that someone criticizes them constructively, but then it becomes like they attack the whole core of oneself. And again, that's kind of very black and white thinking we see a lot in the clinical realm. But it has a level of the narcissistic rage tied to it. So if there's symbols or examples that you're seeing playing out metaphorically or in reality in your therapy sessions with these folks that either are experiencing narcissistic abuse or are narcissists, or if you're working with families and couples and you're seeing it, or children, try to understand the narcissistic rage and how it exists and how it plays out, because that's helpful in evaluating a sense of risk level and trying to develop a safety plan or a sense of what directions the patient needs to evaluate or go. So I talked about one's complicit object. I'll just kind of build on that a tiny bit. So one's complicit object is basically that the narcissist sees the person as an object for the other. So if it is really simplistic, if someone's going out for ice cream and the narcissist was eyeing a flavor and they're going to share the ice cream, right? They ask the couple to make the decision, the partner to make the decision, or the child to make the decision for them, and the child comes back with a flavor that they didn't like, that they would be very frustrated at that level of decision making, and the person should have known what they wanted, that they couldn't make the decision, therefore they deserve to be discredited and devalued. And that's kind of a lame example, but the first one that came to my head. But really, it's about how that object works for the narcissist, and how it should act. And when the narcissist gets angry, it's when that person isn't fully functioning for them, but it also is an operation the narcissist has to kind of maintain devaluing and discrediting that object, to hold them as their object and to make them subservient, to destroy their sense of self, to destroy their sense of self-esteem in very subtle and nuanced ways, and then sometimes some very frank, critical ways, like name-calling, physical abuse, fear, like, we talked about some of these things earlier, or very nuanced ways and kind of subtly character attacking, very subtle ways of emotional abuse and things like that. So I want to kind of move on to the second to last step, which is how do we look at recovery? How do we look at it playing out? How is it triaged? And so I have 3 different levels I kind of view recovery in. So there's recovery repair, and then there's recovery and limits and limit setting, and then there's recovery and cutoff and protectiveness. So recovery repair, recovery limits, recovery cutoffs, or recovery protection. I kind of use both words. So in the recovery repair means, that's like the lightest level of triage, is that there's some sense of capability of the narcissist learning skills like empathy, being communicative in a different way, having different language usage play out between them and the other, that can really diffuse and take away some traits of the narcissism that are oppressive and overwhelming. But it has to come from an actual and sincere and authentic wish for that narcissist to become and accept a little bit of vulnerability, for them to reevaluate their behaviors and be able to be subtly empathic, and to have some tinge of empathy in the situation because of their wish from love and care to maintain or continue a relationship or an interaction. So recovery limit setting is when the person who is suffering the narcissistic abuse experiments with assertive boundary setting. So assertive boundary setting can be really, really broad. So one aspect of assertive boundary setting is there used to be this family member who had a dog that would bite people, and the partner would always put that dog in the narcissist's office. And the narcissist would passive aggressively, when there was big parties, leave the door open, and inevitably someone would get bitten by this dog, and it was usually a kid, and it was really messed up. So an example of assertive boundary setting in the context of this was one of the people with kids going up to that guy and saying, if that dog comes out of that office again, we're out of here and we're making a big deal. If this dog bites anyone, there will be legal charges, right? It's like stern, assertive, tinge of real tough, but it also put the narcissist in their place in a sense and said there will be consequences and this is no joke. Another realm of assertive boundary setting that's a little lighter is had a patient who had a relative who really unfairly would discuss this narcissistic parent of the patient and not respect the boundaries on stopping the conversations. And so that relative was in town, it was an aunt, and the patient said to the aunt, if you bring up this topic and you don't cease when I ask you to cease, this conversation is over, as is this meal, and we will be getting up and leaving collectively, me and my family. And so that was an assertive limit. In a relationship or with a parent, it can be this phone call ends or this interaction ends if you do this or that. If I feel this experience, this conversation or this interaction is over. In relationships, it's a little hard depending on the oppressiveness and depending on the length of time the destructiveness is played out of the narcissistic abuse. But limits can be that there is data collection, CPS, police reports, and those being utilized as a protective kind of framework. And getting involved with a external arm can be a very threatening and overwhelming thing, and sometimes it can play out in a way that might not be helpful if police or CPS workers really aren't attuned to maybe some of the subtle nuances. But it's in cases I've seen where there's been an arrest or a CPS case, those kind of assertive boundaries can be set where the abused partner can say to the narcissist, look, do we want this to end up in another CPS report? Do you want this situation to end up with the police coming? And that is like a very severe kind of limit setting that puts a scenario of consequence in place that hits the narcissist at its core, because it's a character attack on their sense of selves that they become in control of, and they could shift their behavior or not. And I think there's a lot of room for further discussion. I think that could be a topic that we maybe discuss further in the Q&A if people have examples, clinical examples, or thoughts about that. And the last one I call recovery cutoff or recovery limiting or ceasing or separation or divorce. And so that's like the most severe level. Now, in cases of severe danger, logging data, logging experiences, holding on to text, holding on to emails, really create a sense of narrative that is very protective for the victim of a narcissistic abuser. And there's a lot of legal involvement that can play out. I've had patients who have the means to hire private investigators, and that data has also helped them when there's been situations where they needed to implement a stay-away order of protection or refrain from a B order of protection, because they have a kind of neutral, specialized parties data to validate some of the interactions. So whether it was phone calls or interactions that were recorded, or evidentiary data of affairs or doing things that were sketchy. So it's kind of a little smarmy in a sense, if we look at it from that framework, but at the same time, it's also about a sense of self-protection and having as much information as possible. So logging interactions, logging when the narcissist acts like a narcissist, showing that pattern of behavior. This is the legal realm. Getting a private investigator, CPS reports if they're warranted, having connections with school where things are labeled and documented if there's kids involved, getting friends as corroborating witnesses or that they know about what's going on so they can be give statements that are supplemental and supportive. Now, cutoff is a little different. That was kind of the severe repair being in the severe limit of legal action or divorce or separation. and the legal protections and all the information behind that. The other part is, you see this more with parents of narcissistically abused children, is cutoff, where they basically say, I am going to cut you off because of these behaviors, right? And so you kind of go through the tiers. You attempt the repair in most scenarios. You then get to limit setting. And if that's not respected, sometimes it goes to cutoff, because protecting oneself from destructive toxicity is a very important thing, especially when we're talking about some really psychodynamic theories like projective identification and things like that, that it's important to understand how the mind and body take in information and can be destroyed by just the interactions. One example of a patient that I had that cut off from a toxic narcissistic parent was they had looked back on photos, and in all photos without that parent, they were fully affected and smiling. And they were so protective and overwhelmed just in the presence of that parent. They looked like Wednesday Addams or Pugsley Addams with this flatly affected face, and they were it was kind of like a doomsday photograph, or like an old photograph where you're stuck waiting for minutes for the negative to develop. And that is a time when you want to understand the core of the impact of that person on you and the lack of shift. And that's about self-protectionism. How much more can you be at risk? And I see this a lot when people have become parents of their own children, and the narcissist is playing out some of the repeated stuff with their kids. That's when they kind of kick into high gear about either setting limits or really setting a precedent of cutting off and limiting the interactions due to the toxicity. And cutoff doesn't need to be solely just disconnected and cut off. It could be just a frame of reference where visits are much shorter, like a meal out in public, or it's a phone call or a FaceTime, but it's very limited. It's almost like if we look at it like a supervised visitation framework versus a more fully accessible interaction. So that's recovery. And the three tiers: recovery repair, recovery limit setting, or recovery cutoff, or recovery legal action, or separation divorce. So those are the three tiers of kind of how I view recovery. Then I want to talk just really quickly about the deeper work. And I'll go back to Susan Still, who we spoke about earlier, and this being called stupid so many times, or my patients called the little s words, that it became a core sense of themselves. And so the deeper work in therapy is really about seeing the value in oneself, gaining the value in oneself, thinking about the impact on others, the value of them to others, how they exist in the world, how they have meaning to the world in a positive way in others' minds, versus how they've been destroyed in their mind because they've been a non-compliant object to a narcissist. And so regaining one's sense of self, rebuilding one's sense of self, seeing and finding value in one's sense of self. Now, the ways to go about that, I'm inherently biased towards intensive therapy. I'm also very impressed and biased towards seeing some meetup groups that have really seen people align. And in terms of community, the Reddit Raised by Narcissist group is one of the best places for people to get a sense of narcissistic abuse for those who have grown up with narcissistic parents. And there's a couple of narcissistic relationship ones in Reddit too that are just as good. But the Raised by Narcissists one is beautifully done in terms of people's vulnerability, authenticity, the supportive community there, and people having a sense of, I'm not in this alone. And not that it's normalized, but it's credited and valued, their experience. And that's immensely therapeutic, just in them thinking about their experience and their grounding in reality is not being wrong. And that building the value in themselves and their thoughts and their minds and their reality is very, very important. In terms of book references, and I'm just going to name a few, and then we'll kind of do a closing statement. But Alice Miller wrote a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child. And that book is really good for understanding the experience of a child who grows up with a narcissistic parent. And the gifted child is not blessed with a gift, but it's basically almost an anxious hyperintuitiveness of awareness, of taking information, evaluating people's intentions, almost to an overwhelmingly thought out way. And that book is really well done. Then there's Wendy Bahari's Disarming the Narcissist, which is a kind of a more of a cognitive behavioral book that has a real didactic framework that's very concrete, but it's really beautifully developed and written. Then Daniel Shaw wrote a book called Traumatic Narcissism, and it's really about how narcissism is experienced and how to survive it. And there are three wonderful books on the topic. And then the Reddit subreddit Raised by Narcissists is also a great reference as well. And then on YouTube, there's a ton of interviews with Susan Still. You can watch some videos on projective identification by Otto Kernberg. It's Kernberg. And then in terms of information and things like that, my website, I do a ton of videos. So I have a YouTube channel. If you just look up my name, Daniel Sokal, S-O-K-A-L, I have a ton of videos on the topic, and how it plays out in couples and individually, and how you exist when there's a holiday with a family member who's a narcissist and how to get through that. And then my website, which is just my name, danielsokal.com, has similar information as well. So kind of what we did today was, in the beginning, we talked about the definition and role of a narcissist, what a narcissist is, how it's defined by the DSM. Then we talked about narcissistic abuse and all the nuances there. We went over some common examples of the movie Mommy Dearest, Susan Still, and political gaslighting. And then we talked about clinical examples, both with very specific clinical examples, a couple of couples and a parent. And then we talked about some theoretical stuff related to how things play out clinically. Then we talked about recovery repair, which was 3 tiers: recovery repair, recovery limit setting, and recovery cutoffs, and how those are triaged. And then we talked about the deeper work of finding oneself, and therapeutically, what does someone who experiences narcissistic abuse do? I know there's probably things that I missed or wasn't able to touch on. If you have questions, do not hesitate in the comments section to fill them in, and send us comments. And I hope you watch the other presenters that are part of this summit. There's some really great topics. And don't ever hesitate to reach out to me with questions. I always love answering. And I'll do a quick synopsis of myself again, just to reframe. I'm Daniel Sokal. I'm an LCSW. I practice in White Plains, New York, and online for New York and international residents. And I focus on working with individuals, couples, but do a lot of work around narcissism, the narcissistic experience, and narcissistic abuse, as well as some other things that kind of interrelate. And I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have. I teach at a psychoanalytic institute, and I'm affiliated with 3 psychoanalytic institutes, and also supervise. So I come from a very psychoanalytic background. So when you hear me talking about Kernberg and Freud and Kohut, those are some historically significant psychoanalytic figures, but they have been highly, highly influential in CBT and other frameworks of theoretical grounding clinically. So I don't want to discount just by having that theoretical grounding. That's it. There's a whole lot more to the clinical world than just that. I really thank you for you taking the time to pay attention to this subject, because it's a really nuanced but very important one. And I really hope it was helpful for you. And I will quit my blabbering, and I hope you all have a wonderful day and be well. Take care.